In its day, Uruk was a marvel, the largest city that had ever existed in the history of the world, both in terms of size and population. One of the leading cities of Mesopotamia for 1,000 years, at Uruk, we can see clearly for the first time the elements that gave rise to urban civilizations, including division of labor, professional priesthoods, class hierarchy, and segregated work and living spaces. Uruk also carries on the walled city concept begun at Jericho. Here, those walls are credited to the city's very first king, Gilgamesh. In addition, it preserves the first monumental religious complexes found in a city. Now, these have been an element of city construction that we have encountered since the very first city at Uruk, but now they're at this grand scale for the very first time. Building materials and forms at Uruk, notably buttressed mud brick construction, also influenced the construction techniques of cities throughout the region of Southwest Asia and as far away as Egypt. Uruk was an ancient city of Sumer in southern Mesopotamia, now modern Iraq. Actually, the modern state of Iraq derives its name from Uruk. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, they needed a name for this area, and they settled on a name derived from Uruk, but in modern Arabic. And I like that, the idea that Uruk is still with us in this inspirational form. Well, the city we're going to talk about was founded about 5000 BC on the banks of the Euphrates River. The Euphrates, along with the Tigris, are the major rivers that defined the area in antiquity. See, the heart of Iraq is called, or was called then, Mesopotamia. In Greek, the land between the rivers. So these rivers are always of central importance. As a river city, we could compare Uruk to later successful river communities, such as London, Paris, or Rome, or if you think about U.S. cities along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. You go from Pittsburgh to Cincinnati to Louisville, along the Mississippi, from Minneapolis to St. Louis to Memphis to New Orleans, finally. All of these thrive because of the commerce up and down the rivers. Uruk exploited the connections between other Sumerian cities for trade and possibly mutual defense, as well as for the great natural resources it had. The Euphrates River, of course, and the large fertile plains around it for growing crops. At the city's height in 2900 BC, it was crossed with many canals, which brought the waters of the river into the city and were used for transportation as well as irrigation. Maybe you could think of it as the Bronze Age Venice. And it had mud, lots of mud. We may not think of mud as a great natural resource, but it was in antiquity. It's critical for building as well as other industries, which we'll touch on. And Uruk was huge. By ancient standards, absolutely massive. By 2900 BC, it had a walled area of 6 square kilometers. That's about 2.2 square miles. And a population of at least 50,000 people. Some scholars put it at 80,000. Now think back to Uruk with its 8,000 people, or Jericho with 2,000 people. Looking ahead, by comparison, Athens, in its golden age of the 5th century BC, was only 2.5 square kilometers, or just short of 1 square mile. Not until Rome, at the time of the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD, 3,000 years after its great height, was there a city larger than Uruk. This great city imported vast quantities of natural resources from a broad area. Timber from as far away as Lebanon, bitumen, slaves, stones of all kinds, such as flint, obsidian, marble, steatite, that is soapstone, and lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli, that beautiful blue stone which was so sought in antiquity, and comes from actually Afghanistan. The classic example of long-range trade, as well as, of course, traditional building stones and copper. Most of this trade came into the city via the Euphrates River, much of it floating downstream from areas in the north. The tremendous range of these trade materials indicates not just a large city, but a thriving craft industry with highly developed division of labor, since working these materials was very specialized. Completely different techniques were used on obsidian or soapstone, for example. So we have labor division and labor specialization as well. And then there were those walls. The walls of Uruk surrounding this entire large city were irregular in shape. They had about 900 mud brick buttresses, which supported the wall, spaced about 12 meters apart, for an overall wall length of about 6 miles or 10 kilometers. It's absolutely staggering in its size. Now, at the center of the community, both literally and figuratively, were two large religious sanctuaries. Now, I want to stop and emphasize that word sanctuary, because these are not just a temple. They're massive complexes full of a variety of temples and altars, storehouses, homes for priests. They're tremendous complex sanctuaries. One of these is Eanna, the temple complex of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of love and war. And there are a number of these in antiquity, goddesses of love and war together. The other complex is the Anu complex, dedicated to the sky god An. Contemporary with the city walls, by 3100 BC, the Eanna complex was largely complete by then. And think about this. The city's been in existence by this point for almost 2,000 years, but we're still really at the very beginning of the Bronze Age. So it's really a remarkably early period. This complex, the Eanna complex, has over a dozen monumental mud brick buildings. Now, the purpose of these is debated, but their scale and the resources and manpower, or labor if you prefer, that required them, they represent is unquestionable. It is, however, agreed that the temples and associated buildings were more than purely examples of religious devotion. The kings of Uruk associated themselves directly with the gods. By convention, Gilgamesh was descended from a god and a mortal. He himself was part god. And therefore, the rituals conducted here in these sanctuaries certainly also served to reinforce the power of the kings themselves. In addition, we'll see this later on as well, there's evidence that the temples served as food distribution centers. This means that the people of Uruk may have had, as we see later in Egypt, to rely on religious authorities for their food rations. They might come here on a daily basis to get their rations. This, I think, would also tend to reinforce the authority of these deities, in this case, Inanna, and the priests who actually not only interceded on behalf of the community with the gods, but also distributed this food. And also, these priests were connected to the civic authority by the rituals conducted by the king. Implicit in these great sanctuary complexes is the tremendous central organization necessary to coordinate the manpower needed to build these. Furthermore, we see not only a division of labor, which there's been evidence for earlier, but for the first time ever, really strict class hierarchy in urban organizations. The priests were apparently responsible for food distribution to at least a portion of the populace, which granted them, that is the priests, power over the common people. And so this function isolated them from the common people and really creates, I think, class hierarchy, as we might call it, or status hierarchy if you prefer, and some do, in this period. Now, the division of labor that was found at Uruk also did something else, and it allowed for an explosion in artistic creation. For perhaps the first time in the history of the world, we can see here at Uruk art for art's sake. That is, non-functional works that were designed purely for their aesthetic appeal. Among these, for example, we have mosaics of painted clay cones that were embedded in the walls of mud brick buildings. These are small clay cones pressed into the wall of wet mud plaster, point first. Their bases were painted, red, black, or white, And these were used to create designs, mainly triangular patterns. Large numbers of these were found at Uruk across the walls of the community. And for the first time ever in the history of the world, we find together large-scale sculpture in the round and relief carving. The earliest metal casting utilizing the lost wax process is also found at Uruk. And one of the earliest forms of writing, some scholars think it is in fact the earliest human writing, comes from Uruk as well. This writing is called cuneiform. It was based on one of Uruk's major natural resources, mud. Well, in this case, mud and reeds. And what the people did was they made small tablets, each the shape of about a loaf of bread that you could fit in the palm of your hand, made of mud. While these were wet, you would take a reed stylus and write on them using the end of the reed to press into the mud. The triangular shape of the letters that came from the end of that reed gave this form of writing its name cuneiform, or wedge-shaped writing. This writing was a direct byproduct of civic life, that is, of the creation of this urban space, and of the needs of civic and religious officials to organize their urban world. It developed about 3200 BC here in Uruk as a means of recording the management of goods and the allocation of workers' rations. So the earliest writing that we have is nothing terribly inspirational, no literature or poetry. It's documents about goods and services, wheat and animals and things like that. Only later did writing move from the documenting of such things to its use recording poetry, songs, and other forms of literature, including the great Sumerian epic Gilgamesh. Cuneiform tablets and sculpture in various media celebrated this mytho-historic king of Uruk, Gilgamesh. By the way, I would just like to say, Gilgamesh, very underused name anymore. I've only met one person in my life named Gilgamesh, and so I just put that out there for you, just in case you want to consider that. The Epic of Gilgamesh from Uruk is the oldest extant work of human literature, and it's absolutely phenomenal. It tells the story of many of Gilgamesh's adventures and his accomplishments, the building of the walls, for example. The stories throughout the epic are singular, but the major themes are timeless. For the epic explores the nature of friendship, the relationships between gods and men, the meaning of life, what we owe to one another, and the fear of death. Ultimately, the epic concludes that immortality is impossible for humans, but reputation after death gives one a form of immortality, and also having children. Immortality by reputation, immortality by offspring are both presented to us. The book begins and ends with a variation of the same narration, describing Gilgamesh's accomplishments. And it's a marvelous passage. In Uruk, he built walls, a great rampart, and the temple of blessed Eanna for the god of the firmament Anu, and for Ishtar, the goddess of love. Look at it still today. The outer wall where the cornice runs, it shines with the brilliance of copper. In the inner wall, it has no equal. I love this passage, as the components of the city, which defined it to the Sumerians, are all attributed to Gilgamesh, its walls and its great sanctuaries. The people here sought to celebrate the greatness of their city by association with the king Gilgamesh, who was, as the epic tells us, 2/3 god and 1/3 man. The author's way of telling us how extraordinary Gilgamesh truly was. The epic continues. Touch the threshold, it is ancient. Approach Eanna, the dwelling of Inanna, Our Lady of Love and War, the like of which no latter-day king, no man alive can equal. Climb upon the wall of Uruk. Walk along it, I say. Regard the foundation terrace and examine the masonry. Is it not burnt brick and good? This part of the epic is probably accurate and also nostalgic. By the time the story was written down, Uruk no longer controlled the resources to create these monumental complexes, so they're looking back at their distant past when things were great. The oldest versions of the epic we have are in Sumerian from about 2100 BC, although the story is probably about 500 years older than that, and it passed down through oral tradition. Just controlling the resources to achieve such constructions of the walls and sanctuaries and so forth may have, by 2100, have passed out of Uruk's power. For example, that last line I quoted to you about burned brick, it doesn't seem worthy of comment. It seems a little odd, but maybe not worthy of comment. But think about it for just a minute. This is southern Iraq. Even if you can muster the manpower necessary to make millions of bricks because you've got the mud for it, how are you going to fire them? How are you going to bake them? There are no trees. They had to go upstream into northern Iraq and southern Turkey, what is Kurdish Iraq today, Kurdish territory, about 400 miles north or 700 kilometers journey. Traveling north, then they would cut the timber, float it all the way back downstream to Uruk, where they would build massive kilns to burn the wood to fire the bricks. The logistical difficulties here are enormous. And thinking about just this one portion of the city, I think, gives us a sense of its tremendous power and the centralized organization that must have been necessary to make it function and flourish. The Epic of Gilgamesh also refers to Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of love and war, known later, particularly to the Babylonians, as Ishtar. She is the goddess of the Eanna temple complex at Uruk, her most important and perhaps oldest sanctuary anywhere in Mesopotamia. Found also at Uruk was the oldest marble sculpture in the history of the world, an image of Inanna. The head probably was set into a wooden statue, and this is standard in antiquity. Statues were generally made of wooden bodies that were then draped and dressed, actually as you would dress a goddess, or as I guess one would say, as you would imagine a goddess would be dressed. And only the parts that showed, the head and the hands, for example, would be made out of precious stones. In this case, we have this wonderful marble head of Inanna. Its eyes were inlaid with lapis lazuli, again, a stone that had to be imported from Afghanistan. Shell is used also in the eyes, and its eyebrows and hair of bitumen were plated with gold. The interesting thing about this head of Inanna is that it was discovered a long time ago, back in the 1920s, but the head was stolen in the sack of the Baghdad Museum after the American invasion in 2003. And it was actually lost for a number of years, but it's since been recovered. And this was huge for the Iraqis, because this head is really an iconic image for them of their ancient civilization. And so bringing this goddess of Uruk back into the museum in Iraq had a huge symbolic importance to the government of Iraq after, as I say, had been missing for a number of years. All of these expensive imported materials, even just looking at this one sculpture, the things that came together to make it, again argue for a highly developed division of labor and craft specialization. These two components of urban life also led directly to a hierarchy of classes, as overseers rose up to coordinate various crafts. The development of a form of writing that could convey the profound human ideas of the Epic of Gilgamesh deserves, I think, some further consideration. For almost 2,000 years, this writing system, cuneiform, was the means that speakers of all Near Eastern languages had to record their thoughts. Cuneiform tablets are found with this writing that, in fact, is used for languages all the way across Southwest Asia, from Turkey all the way down to Mesopotamia. And, in fact, cuneiform tablets are found in the archives of Egyptian palaces from the Bronze Age. The system of cuneiform began with simple pictographs, that is, images which were related to stories or words, but it quickly grew so complex that professional scribes were required. Because unlike an alphabetic form of writing, pictographs expand endlessly depending on what you need to show or what you need to say. There can, in fact, in cuneiform be literally thousands of forms that you need to memorize. Again, the development of city life led to the need to record particular things, led to craft specialization, which then allowed for more sophisticated social constructs beyond the division of labor, to the rise here in Uruk for the first time of a professional administration bureaucracy and a class above common workers. This meant, of course, that schools were also necessary, as training in cuneiform took years. In effect, cuneiform seems to have both shaped and been shaped by ancient urban life. Sumer, that is the Sumerian area of southern Mesopotamia, is the home of the ziggurat, the mud brick pyramidal temple platforms that raised temples, generally to An, the sky god, higher into the sky, above the terrestrial sphere. The temple on top was used as the residence of the god. All of the rituals would take place outdoors. So the ziggurat essentially bridged the distance between earth and sky, moving the home of the god closer to where he was. And it was restricted space, like the interiors of great Egyptian temples, to be entered only by the priests and we think probably by the king as well. The largest of these temples at Uruk was actually built by Ur-Nammu, whose ziggurat supported the temple to Inanna in about 2100 BC. But in 2900, where we're looking now, there was only one ziggurat at Uruk, and it was in the district of Anu, the sky god. It measured about 197 feet square, or 60 by 60 meters, a huge area. The volume of mud brick is just staggering here. It rose to a height of about 43 feet, or about 13 meters altogether. And again, it's designed as a temple platform, here for what is known as the White Temple. This is so important, this temple, that it's one of the buildings whose construction has been traditionally attributed to Gilgamesh. That is, if you want to inflate the importance of something or indicate its importance, you assign it back to the founder of the society. Now, the White Temple here at Uruk was actually a small building. It's a rectangular building about 60 by 16 feet, constructed in mud brick, but with a whitewashed exterior, which led the excavators to give it that name of the White Temple. The interior consisted of one single large room that held a cult statue, as well as an altar and an offering table. It is the home of the god. Now, in addition to supporting the temple, the top of the ziggurat had exterior space that allowed the priests to watch the heavens. This use of the platform for celestial observation and their subsequent recording of what they saw led to Uruk being an early center for astronomy and related sciences. And that tradition holds true throughout the Middle Ages. Iraq, or the area of Mesopotamia, is an important center for astronomical sciences from the time of Uruk, about 2900 BC, through what we consider the Middle Ages, up to the 16th century. So in a very real sense, the needs of the religion of Anu led to the origins of the science of astronomy. The remains of one of the temples in the district of Anu, that's the region, the sanctuary, is not on a ziggurat, and they demonstrate the exclusive nature of their enclosed space. This small temple is essentially a series of smaller boxes inside other boxes, all within a larger rectangular frame. In the Greek and Roman temples, we would refer to that inner space as an aditon, meaning in Greek, do not enter. This restricted space would hold the cult statue and only be entered by the highest religious officials who would commune in person with the deity. We think that same pattern of worship, which we see in Greek, Roman, and Egyptian cultures, took place here at Uruk earlier on, at this period, about 2900 BC. Much less of Uruk is known about the residential areas. This is partly due to the priorities of early excavators. They wanted to focus on the centralized elite context of the city. They wanted to dig up temples and public buildings, so they ignored houses. Partly, however, it's a matter of preservation, since, as you might expect, the less substantial houses really leave fewer traces than the tremendous temple platforms. The private construction just is effectively ephemeral. For example, no mortuary evidence has been found at all for Uruk in this period. No burials inside or outside the city. Now, the houses seem to have taken a form familiar to us in the Near East or Southwestern Asia. They're courtyard, mud brick houses, rectangular in shape with flat roofs, 1 or 2 stories tall, that filled the city in irregular groups. Those groups are particularly interesting here. Unlike in earlier communities where we think the groups of houses might have been kin or clan-based, that is, family-based, here they seem to have been organized by the profession of the occupants, another component of the division of labor that was so prevalent in Uruk. Much of what we know about these residents and their residences comes from just a very few of those houses that have been excavated, as well as the translated cuneiform tablets found in a few of them. For example, tablets were found in a group of private houses of members of the civic administration. We might call them middle managers. One occupant of a house, Suen, was a supervisor of plowing oxen and was involved in land management and agricultural production, all of which gives excellent evidence of the centralized agriculture of Uruk. Now, there have been tens of thousands of these tablets found, and only a fraction have actually ever been translated. So we'll certainly learn more as the remainder are. Among these tablets, though, is a remarkable poem, the Uruk Lament, giving a poignant account of the conquest of the city, which, along with other Sumerian cities, was conquered in about 2300 BC. The narrator of the lament, quote, consoled himself with tears and laments as the city trembled. A defiled hand smote him. It flattened his skull, and the city collapsed. The capital city, waterway guardian of all nations, became like one who spreads havoc. Enlil, the god of the wind, turned the place to dust, piled the people up in heaps, end quote. Although the exact description of the destruction differs, the despair at the catastrophic loss of Great Uruk is echoed later in Pliny the Younger's description of the volcano that destroyed Pompeii, that is Vesuvius, or in the eyewitness account of the Great Fire of London in 1666, and reactions to the San Francisco earthquake. As we'll see, similar calamities have befallen city after city in human history, yet nothing seems to stop us from gravitating to cities in ever larger numbers. The Sumerian cities, such as Uruk, make an illustrative comparison with those that came before and after. Like Jericho, and on a smaller scale, Çatalhöyük, we can see the importance of religion and community identity. Jericho also shares Uruk's reliance on walls and proximity to a river for its success. From here in Sumeria, we will next look at one of the biggest and best preserved cities of the Indus Valley civilization, Mohenjo-Daro. The parallels to Uruk in this slightly younger city, with its brick construction, great infrastructure, and reliance on a river for its success, should all be familiar. Yet the exact urban forms are unique in the history of cities.